They say you should learn something new every day. Well, today you're going to learn 10 incredibly specific things not to do, courtesy of a group of people who are no longer in a position to benefit from this knowledge. We're opening the case files on 10 of the most logically bankrupt decisions ever made, where the only thing higher than the stupidity was the final price. 1. The late-night drive-thru is historically a sanctuary for quiet shame and acquiring 3,000 calories of processed cheese under unforgiving fluorescent lights. But for one intensely intoxicated rural thrill-seeker, it became the completely illogical arena for his final rodeo. Pushing 2 in the morning and absolutely pickled in a lethal mixture of cheap bourbon and spectacularly bad decisions, our aspiring cowboy accepted a party dare that a sober brain would immediately flag as a terrible idea. His mission was to ride a horse to get a late-night cheeseburger. If he had commandeered a battle-hardened police stallion accustomed to chaotic city noise, this might have just ended with a viral public intoxication charge. Instead, he saddled up a highly skittish, utterly sheltered barn horse whose entire frame of reference for the world consisted of quiet pastures and the occasional mildly startling squirrel. Dragging this innocent, hyper-vigilant prey animal onto the harsh asphalt of a neon-soaked urban sprawl was basically a recipe for catastrophic equestrian failure. From the horse's perspective, the modern city is a terrifying, alien hellscape crawling with roaring metal predators. By the time this deeply traumatized duo navigated into the claustrophobic concrete canyon of the drive-thru lane, the poor animal was practically vibrating out of its horseshoes with unadulterated panic, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. The rider, blissfully ignorant of the massive muscular time bomb he was sitting on, swayed confidently in the saddle. Then came the absolute catalyst for disaster: the intercom speaker. Fast food ordering systems do not emit soothing audio. They weaponize sound, projecting a demonic, ear-piercing blast of metallic static before a disembodied employee voice screeches out of the void. The absolute millisecond that booming, crackling voice demanded to know if he wanted fries, the horse completely abandoned reality. It executed a desperate, explosive, full-panic rear-up, instinctively trying to launch itself backward away from the screeching plastic box of doom. The sudden vertical shift in gravity completely blindsided our drunken urban cowboy. Possessing zero core strength in his inebriated state, he was instantly ejected from the saddle, launching backward like a human cannonball. Drive-thru architects install massive, concrete-filled steel security bollards around ordering stations to stop minivans from crashing into the kitchen, and these pillars are entirely unforgiving to the human cranium. The rider sailed through the humid air, making an abrupt, physics-defying introduction to the immovable steel pillar, an impact that instantly and permanently canceled his subscription to the land of the living. As the terrified horse furiously galloped off into the darkness, successfully escaping the neon nightmare, the rider was left eternally parked at the speaker box, a tragic victim who failed to understand that a jittery farm animal is the absolute worst getaway vehicle in fast food history. 2. There is a highly specific, exceptionally dangerous flavor of midnight boredom that only strikes profoundly intoxicated young men. A condition where the brain's rational risk assessment software promptly uninstalls itself, violently replaced by a primal urge to mess with heavy machinery they fundamentally do not comprehend. This brings us to a spectacularly fatal decision made by 2 buddies wandering an industrial park after a heavy night of drinking, desperately seeking an adventure. They stumbled upon a massive commercial laundry facility that had recently gone bankrupt. But crucially, the local utility company had not quite gotten around to severing the main power grid yet. Discovering a slightly ajar-loading dock door, our intrepid explorers decided to trespass, wandering into the pitch-black warehouse, illuminated only by the feeble glow of their smartphones, treating a hazardous industrial zone like a free playground. Deep in the bowels of the facility, they discovered the absolute holy grail of terrible ideas: an industrial water extractor. This machine was not a gentle household appliance. It was a massive, heavy-duty commercial centrifuge engineered to rip hundreds of pounds of soaking wet hotel linens completely dry by spinning them at mathematically absurd, gravity-defying speeds. It is essentially an astronaut gravitational training simulator built exclusively for wet towels. Naturally, when these two guys saw a giant metal drum, big enough to comfortably fit a human being, and a control panel still blinking with green lights, they did not see a lethal industrial hazard. They saw a free underground carnival ride. The logic, heavily subsidized by several gallons of cheap beer, was brutally simple. One guy boldly declared he was going to climb inside the drum to experience the spin, while the other confidently assumed the role of operations manager at the control panel. The self-appointed test pilot squeezed his body into the cold steel cylinder, giggling like a schoolboy, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just crawled into a high-speed, industrial-grade spin cycle. His buddy on the outside, possessing all the technical expertise of a concussed golden retriever, simply started mashing buttons until he heard the deep, terrifying electrical hum of the massive industrial motor engaging. The heavy steel door aggressively locked with a loud mechanical clank, a sound that really should have been their final warning to abort. Instead, the drum immediately accelerated from 0 to a terrifying, high-pitched whine, bypassing any gentle spin cycle and instantly chasing maximum velocity. Inside the drum, the amusement park fantasy evaporated into unimaginable physiological horror. The human body is fundamentally a sack of soft organs suspended in liquid, and it is fundamentally not designed to withstand the extreme, sustained centrifugal forces generated by a machine built to violently rip moisture from heavy canvas. As the drum hit its peak rotations, the astronomical force brutally pinned the man against the steel wall, causing a catastrophic biological system failure as his human anatomy rapidly surrendered to the unforgiving laws of extreme centrifugal force. By the time his panicked friend outside figured out the emergency stop button, the impromptu ride had already delivered a one-way ticket to the afterlife, leaving the coroner with the baffling task of explaining how a guy managed to suffer astronaut-grade centrifugal trauma inside a bankrupt laundromat. 3. Let us take a moment to deeply analyze the bizarre psychology of the extreme sports enthusiast, specifically the kind of guy whose sheer desperation for social validation completely overrides his basic survival instincts, leading him to treat gravity like a mild suggestion rather than an unforgiving law of the universe. Our next Darwin Award winner hails from the sunny shores of California, a man who looked at the already ridiculous, inherently perilous hobby of extreme unicycling and boldly decided that it simply was not quite lethal enough to properly stroke his massive ego. Hopping a single wheel down a flight of concrete stairs is one thing, but this guy needed a captive audience, astronomical stakes, and to prove a point to the group of friends he had dragged to the base of a towering coastal cliff. His brilliantly idiotic master plan was to haul his unicycle up a steep, treacherous hiking trail to the very summit, and then dramatically ride back and forth along the razor-thin, completely unfenced lip of the precipice while his buddies filmed the spectacle from the safety of the beach far below. We must address the glaring, mathematically catastrophic mechanical flaw at the center of this entire operation. Unlike a standard bicycle with 2 points of contact providing a reliable gyroscopic baseline of stability, a unicycle has exactly 1 point of contact, meaning it possesses precisely 0 inherent balance. It relies entirely on the rider's constant, frantic, panicked micro-adjustments just to stay upright on a flat, freshly paved surface. Taking this inherently unstable circus prop to the jagged, crumbling, wind-swept edge of a massive drop is basically a brazen, intentional flirtation with instant death. Mounting his lone wheel right on the lip of the abyss, the Pacific Ocean roaring hundreds of feet below, he was totally consumed by his own perceived coolness. He began to pedal, hovering mere inches from a drop that guaranteed a shockingly abrupt conclusion to his timeline, completely ignoring the geological reality of his chosen stage. He tragically forgot that the edge of a coastal cliff is not made of solid, predictable concrete. It is composed of loose dirt, crumbling sandstone, and tiny, treacherous pebbles constantly eroded by the harsh ocean wind. Attempting a daring pivot maneuver to secure his legendary status, the tire of his unicycle rolled directly over a piece of gravel no larger than a breath mint. On a normal mountain bike, you would barely even register the bump. On a unicycle perched on a crumbling cliff, it was an immediate death sentence. The tiny rock acted like a lethal ball bearing, instantly breaking the tire's fragile traction on the loose earth. The wheel wildly shot out from underneath him sideways. When you lose your balance on a unicycle, There is no metal frame to catch you, no second wheel to correct the slide. You simply fall in whichever direction gravity harshly dictates. Unfortunately for our extreme athlete, gravity dictated a harsh introduction to the absolute void. With no chance to grab a ledge, brace himself, or even properly scream, he pitched headfirst over the terrifying drop, plummeting downward in a tragic freefall that abruptly ended with a violently definitive finale on the jagged coastal rocks at the very bottom. In the ultimate twist of bitter irony, the unicycle itself lazily fell backward onto the safe, flat grass at the top of the cliff, surviving the entire ordeal completely unscathed. 4. Rural machismo is a fascinating psychological affliction that dictates a man's intrinsic worth is directly proportional to the raw horsepower sitting in his barn, a mindset that inevitably transforms standard agricultural equipment into deadly weapons of ego. We travel to the sun-baked expanse of rural Brazil to examine a spectacular failure of common sense, involving two neighboring farmers locked in a tragically stupid debate over whose tractor possessed superior pulling capabilities. A rational person might settle a dispute over mechanical torque by simply reading the manufacturer's specifications. But these guys operated under the belief that reading is for cowards and real science requires heavy diesel fumes and the imminent threat of property damage. The older gentleman was fiercely defending the honor of his vintage rust bucket machine, firmly convinced his decades-old iron beast held some mystical strength that modern engineering could never replicate. To settle the score, they bypassed all logical testing methods and decided to chain their massive vehicles together, rear to rear, in a dirt lot to engage in a gladiatorial tug-of-war. Here is where we desperately need a brief lesson in heavy machinery physics. Tractors are engineered to pull heavy loads horizontally from a low center of gravity, like a plow dragging through soil. But if you rigidly chain the back of a tractor to an immovable object, like an equally stubborn opposing tractor roaring at full throttle, the staggering rotational force generated by the engine has literally nowhere to travel horizontally once the tires grip the dirt. The laws of physics dictate that the energy must go somewhere, and that somewhere is decisively upward. As the deafening roar of overworked diesel engines shattered the countryside, the older farmer dumped his clutch, determined to drag his rival across the county line. The heavily treaded rear tires of his vintage machine bit fiercely into the earth. Instead of moving backward, the sheer, unadulterated torque grabbed the entire chassis and forcefully rotated it around the locked rear axle. The front wheels violently launched into the air, but the driver, wholly blinded by his own competitive hubris, kept his foot pinned firmly to the accelerator. In a fraction of a second, the aging tractor achieved full verticality before violently slamming backward in a catastrophic flip, bringing thousands of pounds of unforgiving iron crashing backward, instantly turning the exposed driver's seat into a 2-ton iron coffin with a diesel heartbeat. The man who spent the morning bragging about his machine's legendary pulling power was abruptly and permanently removed from the census by it, leaving the surviving farmer as the undisputed tug-of-war champion, though his only prize was a lifetime supply of nightmares and the grim distinction of witnessing the most brutally ironic demonstration of torque in agricultural history. 5. Within the intensely dangerous confines of a modern chemical processing plant, warning labels are not polite suggestions. They are the literal instructions on how to clock out at 5 o'clock with your skeleton still safely stored inside your skin. Our next tragically flawed protagonist was an industrial maintenance worker who possessed a uniquely lethal combination of extreme laziness and a staggering disregard for the basic principles of thermodynamics. His assigned task for the afternoon was incredibly straightforward. He just needed to flush out a designated drainage line using a standard high-pressure water hose. The correct, perfectly safe valve for this mundane chore was clearly marked with bright, unmistakable signage reading water drain. Unfortunately for everyone within a half-mile radius, that particular valve was located all the way on the opposite side of the sweltering, cavernous boiler room. Standing right next to our monumentally lazy hero was a completely different pipe, one heavily wrapped in glowing yellow hazard tape, practically vibrating with intense internal heat, and adorned with a massive placard explicitly reading "Danger Molten Sulfur." Confronted with the agonizing prospect of having to walk perhaps 40 additional feet, his compromised brain performed a fatally flawed cost-benefit analysis. He decided carrying the hose across the concrete floor was far too exhausting, rationalizing that a pipe is just a pipe, and the terrifying skull and crossbones sticker was probably leftover from some unrelated plumbing project. Let us briefly discuss the terrifying thermodynamic reality he was about to create. Liquid sulfur exists at roughly 300 degrees Fahrenheit, essentially a pressurized stream of yellow hellfire. When pressurized cold water suddenly encounters that extreme thermal environment, it violently expands to nearly 2,000 times its volume, flashing spontaneously into steam. Utterly oblivious to the devastating pressurized trap he was meticulously constructing, he happily attached the brass coupling of his cold water hose directly to the molten sulfur line, twisted the spigot wide open, and confidently unleashed a torrent of water into the liquid magma. The chemical reaction did not offer a second chance to rethink his life choices. The instant the cold water collided with the superheated sulfur inside the heavy steel pipe, it created an apocalyptic, localized pressure spike that fatally overwhelmed the structural integrity of the metal. The resulting catastrophic steam explosion erupted with the sudden concussive force of an underground volcano. It instantly transformed the massive iron pipe into a localized, room-clearing blast of superheated pressure that effectively vaporized the deeply confused worker's immediate surroundings, ending his shift in a fraction of a millisecond and issuing an immediate, non-negotiable early retirement from the mortal coil. 6. Routine office. Fire drills in corporate America are generally designed exclusively to be mind-numbingly boring, mostly serving as an excuse to make awkward small talk with accounting in the parking lot. But for the resident office clown, this mandatory safety exercise was a golden opportunity to transform a regular Tuesday afternoon into a blockbuster action movie. This guy was the classic workplace attention seeker, someone harboring a secret, completely unearned belief that he possessed the athletic prowess of a Hollywood stuntman. When the shrill wail of the fire alarm pierced the sterile atmosphere of the 5th floor, his co-workers dutifully shuffled toward the emergency stairwell like a herd of depressed sheep. Our hero, however, decided this was his grand chance to bypass the crowded stairs and achieve absolute legendary status by rappelling down the exterior of the corporate glass facade. He aggressively smashed the hallway emergency cabinet, yanked out the heavy, brightly colored canvas fire hose, tied one end securely to a massive structural support column, and dramatically kicked open the reinforced window. Here is the fatal flaw in his cinematic fantasy. A flat, woven canvas fire hose is structurally nothing like the dynamic, round climbing ropes utilized by professional mountaineers. A real climbing rope works in tandem with specialized mechanical friction devices, whereas a dry fire hose is completely flat, stiff, slick to the touch, and geometrically impossible for a human hand to grip tightly enough to support 180 pounds of dead weight. Utterly ignoring the horrified gasps of the marketing department gathered by the elevators, he confidently hopped up onto the narrow concrete window ledge, flashing a smug grin that loudly suggested he was about to star in his own personal action franchise. He grabbed the flat canvas fabric tightly with his bare, lotion-softened office hands, threw his legs over the terrifying abyss, and boldly leaned backward out into the open air, fully expecting to effortlessly glide down the side of the building like a tactical operative. Gravity, completely devoid of a sense of humor, instantly called his bluff. The instant his full weight transferred to the slick canvas, his meager grip strength was summarily eradicated. There was absolutely no cinematic sliding, no graceful descent, and no cool friction burns. His hands simply shot straight off the slippery hose as if it had been heavily greased with industrial lubricant. He plummeted backward into the void, perfectly executing a terrifying, unchoreographed free-fall past floors 4, 3, 2, and 1, screaming all the way down before executing a devastatingly final, zero-bounce landing on the asphalt of the executive parking tarmac, serving as a brutal reminder that gravity always wins. 7. The treacherous waters off the coast of Australia have claimed countless seasoned mariners. But our next incredibly avoidable tragedy involves a commercial pearl diver whose absolute worst enemy was his own fiercely stubborn dedication to extreme workplace laziness. This was a man renowned throughout the local docks for possessing a spectacularly cavalier attitude toward basic maritime safety, the kind of hardened aquatic cowboy who viewed mandatory operational checklists as deeply offensive insults to his nautical masculinity. His philosophy was essentially that corners were not just meant to be cut, they were meant to be gleefully sawed off and thrown into the ocean. The stage for his final dive was set on a sweltering afternoon when a thick nylon mooring rope carelessly slipped off the deck and completely wrapped itself around the dive boat's solid bronze propeller, violently bogging down the heavy engine. The fundamental instinct of self-preservation explicitly dictates that before a human jumps into the water near a propeller, the captain must completely shut down the motor and securely lock the transmission in neutral. Our ruthlessly efficient corner cutter, however, decided that the 30 seconds required to climb to the helm and power down the machinery was an unacceptable waste of his precious time. Confidently assuming the thickly tangled rope was providing more than enough friction to keep the massive bronze blades safely immobilized, he left the engine idling loudly in forward gear, grabbed his favorite serrated dive knife, clamped his air regulator between his teeth, and splashed backward into the murky water. He swam directly underneath the rumbling hull, perfectly positioning himself in the fatal strike zone, and began furiously hacking away at the stubborn bindings. What this spectacularly overconfident diver fundamentally failed to calculate was the terrifying physics of stored mechanical torque. The industrial-grade engine was actively pushing against the bind with hundreds of horsepower, violently waiting for a release. The exact nanosecond his heavy-duty blade successfully sawed through the very last critical strand of the nylon rope, all of that pent-up rotational kinetic energy was instantly unleashed. The massive propeller roared to life, immediately resuming its lethal high-speed rotation. In a stroke of brutally ironic tragedy, the very first thing the churning blade snagged in the chaotic water was not seaweed, but the floating slack of the diver's own yellow surface-supplied air hose. In a fraction of a second, the thick rubber hose wrapped tightly around the spinning metal shaft, instantly transforming his essential umbilical cord into a high-speed motorized fishing line. With zero time to unbuckle his weight belt or register the catastrophic magnitude of his error, the diver was relentlessly reeled directly into the churning, unforgiving mechanical embrace of the massive engine he had just graciously liberated, freeing the boat but securing a forever lease at the bottom of the Darwin Award leaderboards. 8. The endless battle between Midwestern agricultural professionals and the unforgiving mud of their sprawling fields usually just leads to expensive property damage, but occasionally it escalates into a masterclass of fatal mechanical incompetence. We travel to a rain-soaked farm in rural Illinois to examine the final moments of a fiercely independent farmer whose absolute refusal to ask for professional help transformed a minor logistical annoyance into a gruesome industrial catastrophe. His colossal combine harvester, a prehistoric iron beast of modern agriculture, had driven directly into a hidden mud bog and completely buried its massive tires. A rational human facing a completely immobilized 50,000-pound machine would swallow their pride and dispatch a heavy-duty commercial tow truck to safely winch the equipment out of the mire. Our stubbornly frugal pioneer, however, viewed calling a tow service as a devastating personal failure, opting instead to orchestrate a highly dangerous, completely unregulated one-man extraction operation. He fired up his secondary, slightly smaller utility tractor, backed it up to the deeply stuck combine, and connected the two massive iron behemoths with a thick steel logging chain. To execute this maneuver properly, a driver needs to be securely seated inside the reinforced steel cab of the combine, ready to manage the throttle the second the massive tires break free from the muddy suction. But our monumentally lazy protagonist decided that climbing the steep metal ladder all the way back up into the elevated operator's cabin was just too much cardio for one afternoon. He devised a lethally stupid shortcut. Standing directly on the muddy ground, perfectly positioned in the rapidly shrinking kill zone, right between the rear hitch of the pulling tractor and the colossal front tires of the combine, he reached his arm deep into the exposed engine compartment. His brilliant strategy was to manually hotwire the starter solenoid directly from the ground to bump the engine to life, completely forgetting the absolute most critical variable in this catastrophic equation. He had deliberately left the combine's heavy-duty transmission locked firmly in first gear to assist with the pull. The very instant his greasy screwdriver bridged the electrical contacts, the massive diesel engine did not just sputter, it violently roared to life at a high idle. With the transmission fully engaged, the colossal combine violently lurched forward, instantly breaking free from the muddy vacuum. The massive agricultural tires, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing thousands of pounds, immediately gripped the earth and forcefully rolled forward. The farmer, utterly trapped in the muddy trench of his own making, suddenly found himself occupying the rapidly disappearing physical space between his parked tractor and an unstoppable diesel-powered force. With no time to dive out of the way, he was brutally introduced to the terrifying concept of heavy tread compression in the most personal, undeniable way imaginable, instantly becoming an organic speed bump beneath the very machine he was trying to save. 11. The inherently perilous, highly unregulated world of amateur experimental aviation is a terrifying subculture entirely populated by overconfident adrenaline junkies who firmly believe buying equipment online instantly grants them the skills of a fighter pilot. Enter Kevin, a self-taught, unlicensed thrill-seeker whose desire for digital clout vastly outweighed his grasp of basic spatial geometry. He bypassed the rigorous, expensive process of actual flight school and simply purchased a high-powered, fully functional second-hand paramotor off a sketchy internet marketplace. Now, an important aeronautical reality check for the chronically grounded. A paramotor is essentially a massive industrial fan strapped to a backpack, generating forward thrust while the pilot hangs suspended beneath a colossal 30-foot-wide fabric paraglider wing. The crucial engineering detail here is that the human pilot dangles securely 15 to 20 feet completely below the actual aerodynamic canopy that keeps them airborne. Having miraculously managed to get his aggressively loud contraption airborne from a local municipal park without instantly tangling himself in a high-voltage power line, a rational human would have gently circled the safety of the grassy field. But Kevin was absolutely consumed by an overwhelming desire to put on a spectacular, viral aerial show for his minimal social media following. He decided that simple, high-altitude flight was entirely too boring, formulating a completely idiotic plan to aggressively dive his motorized backpack and thread the needle directly underneath a heavily reinforced concrete highway overpass spanning a shallow local river. He actually spent a Tuesday afternoon meticulously measuring the physical gap with a digital laser rangefinder. The clearance between the rushing water and the heavy concrete beams was exactly 20 feet. Standing at a perfectly average 6 feet tall, this amateur aviator smugly calculated that he had more than enough vertical room to comfortably zip his physical body and the fan right through the middle. He aggressively squeezed the handheld throttle, sending the roaring paramotor into a steep, buzzing dive toward the river, lining up his dangling legs with the narrow, unforgiving rectangular gap of the bridge. He was flying entirely by the seat of his pants, a wide, adrenaline-fueled grin plastered across his face as he rapidly closed the distance at 45 miles an hour. He perfectly visualized his triumphant cinematic flight right through the concrete tunnel, entirely forgetting the absolutely critical, 30-foot-wide inflated parachute proudly flying 2 stories directly above his helmet. The unyielding reality of his monumental mathematical oversight arrived with a devastating, high-speed finality. As Kevin smoothly skimmed over the water and his physical body effortlessly cleared the bottom lip of the bridge, the massive fabric wing acting as his sole source of anti-gravity violently slammed square into the solid, immovable side of the highway infrastructure. The heavy municipal concrete acted like a gigantic, unimaginably brutal fly swatter, instantly collapsing the inflated canopy and abruptly stripping away every single ounce of aerodynamic lift in a fraction of a millisecond. Gravity immediately and forcefully reasserted its total dominance, dropping the heavily weighted pilot straight down like an unceremonious sack of wet cement into the shallow, jagged, rocky riverbed below. The spectacularly ironic conclusion to his highly anticipated viral stunt was officially recorded by a bewildered local fisherman who provided an official police statement noting that he watched a man successfully fly his own torso underneath a bridge while simultaneously crashing his wings into the side of it, proving definitively that completely forgetting about the top half of your aircraft carries a permanent fatal penalty. 10. The merciless, unrelenting brutality of an Arizona summer is essentially a dry run for eternal damnation. A staggering thermal landscape that actively tries to eliminate anything foolish enough to wander away from an air-conditioned building, driving otherwise rational people to invent incredibly stupid, fatal solutions to simple problems. This brings us to a spectacularly frugal desert resident, whose car's air conditioning unit completely failed right in the middle of July, transforming the dark-colored interior of his sedan into a rolling, suffocating convection oven. Instead of simply swallowing his pride, opening his wallet, and scheduling a routine appointment with a certified automotive technician to properly repair the mechanical Freon leak, our ruthlessly cheap protagonist decided to engage in some aggressively amateur thermodynamic engineering. He was utterly oblivious to the fatal high school chemistry lesson he was about to administer to himself. He drove his sweltering mobile sauna to the local grocery store and confidently purchased 2 massive, incredibly dense blocks of commercial dry ice, carrying them out to the parking lot with a smug sense of intellectual superiority. He placed these frozen bricks of absolute zero directly onto the passenger seat, treating them like icy, silent co-pilots in his brilliant crusade against the desert heat. Now, he possessed just enough logic to realize he wanted to cool the car, but he tragically lacked the fundamental scientific literacy to understand what dry ice actually is. It is not frozen water, it is solid, highly compressed carbon dioxide, and it does not melt into a harmless puddle of liquid. It aggressively sublimates directly from a solid block into a heavy, invisible, odorless, oxygen-displacing gas. To truly maximize the cooling efficiency of his genius invention and ensure that absolutely none of that precious, frosty air escaped into the baking desert atmosphere, he firmly rolled up all 4 tinted windows, sealed the cabin tight, and turned the broken fan onto full recirculation mode to blow the chilly vapor around. He confidently merged onto the blistering highway, actually feeling a delightfully crisp, refreshing wave of cold air begin to dramatically lower the temperature inside the vehicle. He likely spent the first 10 minutes of the drive silently congratulating himself for outsmarting the entire automotive repair industry. However, as the massive blocks of dry ice rapidly sublimated in the ambient heat, they were violently flooding the sealed, airtight cabin with pure, suffocating carbon dioxide, aggressively pushing every single molecule of breathable oxygen out through the floorboard vents. Here is the insidious trick of rapid carbon dioxide displacement in a sealed space. At low concentrations, your body screams at you to crack a window. But when the levels skyrocket this fast, flooding an airtight cabin all at once, the gas completely overwhelms and short-circuits the body's alarm system before it can even sound. He did not choke, he did not panic, and he did not claw at the windows. One moment he was smugly enjoying his Arctic paradise, and the next his vision quietly narrowed into a warm, peaceful tunnel of absolutely nothing as his deeply chilled brain gently powered down for the last time. He peacefully drifted out of consciousness, his foot slipping off the gas as the car safely rolled to a gentle stop on the gravel shoulder, his biological systems quietly going offline one by one. He achieved his goal with flawless, terrifying perfection. When the highway patrol finally discovered his parked car several hours later, the interior was a beautifully crisp, deeply refreshing 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the terribly frugal driver was permanently refrigerated in the front seat, the peacefully frozen victim of his own lethally efficient science fair project. I'm curious, which story genuinely made you physically cringe the most? Not the goriest, but the one where the sheer secondhand embarrassment and stupidity was just too much to handle. Let me know which one it was down below. Subscribe, so we can all cringe together again next time.